everyone, this is Jane with Barlow Herbal, and happy Sunday, January 11th of 2026. Now, I went into this week's journaling very intentionally because the last couple of weeks I've been talking about the idea of taking my nephew Ben Hardy's book that he wrote, his most recent one, called The Science of Scaling. And this is an entrepreneurial book, and it talks about the framework from an organizational psychologist's view and all of his work on scaling your business. And so the last couple of weeks, I've really been thinking about what if we just added the word joy to the framework and flip the script a little bit, because I love the premise of this book and I've read all of his books. In fact, I'm really lucky that I typically not only will get a draft sometime on an email that I get to read through, but I'll always get a galley copy. So before it's printed, there's a bunch of galleys that are sent out to different bookstores or podcasters or whatever, and I always get one of those copies. So when this book first was, coming out, I got to read it, and it's an amazing book for anybody who has a business, wants to grow their business, and wants to do it in a really different way. So the way Ben thinks is amazing. So I've just really kind of been thinking, what if we just added the word joy to the end of that and took his framework and applied it to scaling joy? And wow, some really cool things came out, because what I did is I pulled his book up on Audible, which I believe you can actually download this book for free on Audible, because his mission is to get this in as many entrepreneurs' hands as possible so that we can grow high consciousness companies. He is such a heart-centered soul, and his mission is so profound. And for how young he is, he just turned 38 this past week. He is just an amazing individual. So I opened it up on Audible. I got my copy, my hard copy, and I went through it throughout my whole journaling this week. And I took the framework of each chapter and I repositioned it with the idea of scaling joy. So I'm so excited to go through this with you because it brought up some really, really interesting things. So the framework that Ben uses for the science of scaling, it's really modeled after really core ideas. And the very first one is identity, but let me read this to you. So what I wrote here is, what if I applied this to human aliveness rather than a company? So I have come to believe that when we express joy, we are just expressing human aliveness. Okay, so I've written down some really incredible things. So the core premise of Ben's book is this: growth is not linear. It's not a linear effort. It's identity, it's environment, it's leverage, and it's intentional subtraction. So think about that. You're intentionally subtracting things from, let's say, a business where, Ben focuses his work to scale your company. So it's more about what you don't do than what you do. So it's identity, environment, leverage, and intentional subtraction. So what I figured is, when we translate this to joy, something really powerful happens. Okay, and here's what I discovered. Joy scales not by doing more, but by becoming someone who experiences life differently. Okay, so think about that. That right there is powerful. So the framework for expanding the felt experience of being alive. So being alive, the aliveness of being a human. Okay, that's what it's all about, right? Okay, so the very first chapter is all about identity. So let's look at joy as an identity and not as an emotion. So think about that. So Ben, in his work, what he does is he says this: identity precedes behavior. Companies don't scale by hustling harder. They scale when they become a different kind of organization. Okay, so think about that. So now, if we're going to do this to joy, scaling joy begins with shifting your identity. It's not mood management anymore. So you're shifting your identity. You're not just managing your emotions, right? So the old frame is this: I try to feel happy sometimes. Have you ever heard yourself saying that or thinking that? I do my best to feel happy. I try to feel happy sometimes. That's not joy. Okay, so here's the new frame, the new identity. I am someone who experiences life deeply and often. Perfect, right? So here are three questions that you can ask yourself when it comes to scaling joy with your identity. Who is the version of me that naturally feels joy? Who is that? Who do I identify? Okay. Who is the version of me that naturally feels joy? What do they expect from life? What does that version of you expect from life? Okay. And what do you no longer tolerate? Perfect. So joy scales when happiness is assumed, not chased. We shouldn't have to chase joy. We can assume the identity of joy, which is perfect. Okay, so the second chapter is about subtraction. So you want to remove joy killers before adding joy habits. Okay, so think about that. What kills your joy? Before you add the habits of joy, discover what is killing your joy. So what Ben emphasizes in his book is elimination before optimization. Okay. Most people try to add gratitude, meditation, pleasure while dragging around silent joy drains. Okay. So think about that. Most people will, they'll add gratitude, meditation, pleasure. I mean, how many times even have I said over the years, add gratitude, have an attitude of gratitude. I mean, we've been saying that ad nauseum, and I think gratitude is a beautiful thing. Okay, so it's not about adding those things. Okay, this is a whole different way to look at this. So most people try to add gratitude, meditation, or pleasure while dragging around silent joy drains, things that just drain you. Okay, so here's some things that I found are common things for me that can bottleneck my joy. Low grade resentment, chronic obligation. Okay, who can't relate to that, right? Identity mismatches, which by that I mean when we live someone else's values. Okay, think about the impact of just that statement alone. Identity mismatches. We're just dragging around other people's values. Okay, environmental friction like noise, clutter, and digital overload. That's just environmental friction. Okay, and I do talk about that all the time about removing the noise. Okay, and then unresolved grief or someday dreams. I mean, think about the power of just saying that, right? What unresolved grief or someday dreams do you have? Someday, someday, someday. You know that's crazy to think about. So here's you cannot scale joy on top of emotional debt. Okay? That can be pretty strong right there. You cannot scale joy on top of emotional debt. So here's some questions to ask yourself. What am I still carrying that my nervous system is exhausted from holding? Where in my life am I tolerating misalignment out of familiarity or fear? And then this, what would I grieve, release, or complete if joy were my priority? Okay, that's super powerful. So before you ask yourself, what brings me joy? Ask yourself this, what is quietly stealing my joy every day? Subtract. What is quietly stealing your joy? Okay. Now, the third chapter talks about the environmental design. And what I love about this is Ben is very famous for a book he wrote a few years ago. It was one of his first books called Willpower Doesn't Work. And the premise behind that, one of the things is you need to change your environment. You can have willpower. Say you wanted to lose weight, but you keep chips and cookies and unhealthy food in your house. You can have willpower until, all of a sudden you have a bad day or you're emotionally upset about something, and then the bad food is in your environment. So one of the core things that Ben talks about is how important your environment is. So let's relate this to joy. Okay. So environment design, and in this context, joy is context dependent. Okay. So here's what I would say. So, and then I wrote this, Ben argues that environment beats willpower. And I wrote, joy is no different. So joy is no different. Okay. You don't generate joy. So hear me out on this. You enter conditions where joy emerges naturally. Okay. You don't generate joy. You enter conditions where joy emerges naturally. Okay. So here are some things that I think are joy enabling environments. Okay. people who are emotionally available. So these are environments that are going to help you enable joy. People who are emotionally available, physical spaces that feel safe and beautiful, time structures with white space. Okay, that means some different things for everybody. White space, just empty space. Okay, and rhythms that match your nervous system. Rhythms that match your nervous system. And I know a lot of you, if you've been kind of tuning in and watching me for a while, you know that these are all things that are layered on top of other things that I have been talking about now for years, right? So here's what I wrote. Joy. Joy scales when your default environment simply supports aliveness. That's just your default environment. This is over the years I've kind of talked about, from my perspective, what brings me joy is a really clean, uncluttered space where I live. And to me, this is a default environment for me to feel um, safe, secure, joy, aliveness, because it helps to calm my nervous system. That's a default environment for me, is just organization and cleanliness. And I know that can be different for everybody, but I also think for most human beings, if they've not experienced that, they really don't understand the type of joy that brings. Okay, so that's just a default environment. So if joy requires effort, then your environment is misaligned. Okay, so that came out. So here's some questions about your environmental design. In which spaces do I feel most like myself without effort? That is so good. That is so good. Who or what consistently regulates or dysregulates my inner state? Oh, that is not only good, that is so freaking huge. That is so huge. Who or what consistently regulates or dysregulates my inner state? You can immediately, when I say that question, bring someone to the top of your mind or a situation, right? And then what environments am I outgrowing, even if they once supported me? There are environments that you will outgrow, and it's okay. It's actually better than okay. Okay. So if joy requires effort, your environment is misaligned. That's the bottom line on your environment. Now, the next chapter talks about leverage, which is really, really awesome in any situation, especially if you're talking about scaling your company. But when we're talking about scaling joy, I've discovered that leverage is just as important. So here's where I took this. So small inputs equal exponential joy. Okay, so here's what I mean by that. In business, when you scale, leverage creates outsized returns. Okay, so think about the leverage of the right thing. You could think about anything that leverages anything else. And when you have the right leverage, it outsizes the returns. So if you take this in the context of joy, in joy, leverage comes from experiences that change how you perceive everything else. And this is what happens when you leverage business scaling, but the same thing happens when you leverage joy. Okay, so in joy, leverage comes from experiences that change how you perceive everything else. And here's some ideas on what I thought that would apply to. So think about just the idea of being in awe. When you see something beautiful or you experience something beautiful. So I'm talking about things like nature, art, music, and something that feels a little magical or mysterious. Something that creates awe in you. Okay? Meaningful novelty. Okay, think about when you introduce someone to something new, like, through the eyes of a child, when you're taking a child to a park for the first time or to the zoo for the first time. As adults, we stop doing these things. So to me, this is part of novelty, meaningful novelty, something new, okay? Deep presence and not productivity, okay? So this is not about how productive can I be. I'm not saying you shouldn't be productive. Okay, this is about deep presence, being here deeply, being in the moment deeply. Contribution beyond yourself. This one is super, super important because this is a leverage and multiplier. This to me multiplies, this acts at, when you contribute meaningfully, that is leverage to your joy factor, okay? And then this embodied experiences, things that you do that are experiences that you can literally embody, things like movement, touch, breath work, things like this. I know when I climb to the top of one of my favorite mountains here, that involves all of these: movement, breath work, um, touch, just being on the trail, touching the trees, you know, all of the things. Okay, that is an embodied experience. All right, these experiences don't just feel good once, and this is the important thing about leveraging like this. They recalibrate the happiness baseline that you have. So this is not when you have an experience that you are embodying, then you are actually recalibrating your happiness baseline. Like, think about it that way. And that is actually what's happening in your biology, in your frequency, in your energy field. Okay? One moment of awe can rewire weeks of perception. One moment. One moment. In fact, I get chills just saying that because I've experienced that over and over again. Okay, so here's some questions to ask yourself about leveraging joy. Okay, first of all, small inputs equal exponential joy. Okay, which experiences expand my sense of time, meaning, or awe most reliably? So ask yourself, what are the experiences that expand your sense of time, meaning, or awe most reliable? Find the things that are the most reliable. They can be tiny, tiny things, and they can expand your reality of joy. And then this: what moments recalibrate how I see everything else afterward? When you have something that changes the way you perceive things, um, that is massive leverage. Okay. And then this: if I had less energy, what few inputs would matter the most? That's a very, very important question, because you don't want to expend all of your energy on these big things that don't matter and steal your joy. You want the small things that change things exponentially, give you the most leverage. Okay. Which I love. Now, the fifth chapter talks about what he calls time horizon. Okay. And this is where joy compounds. So this is what, this is what Ben says. Ben highlights future-based identity. And he actually wrote a book called Be Your Future Self Now. That's one of his books. So he takes a lot of the concepts that he's written about and weaves this psychology into the books that he currently writes. So this is a beautiful thing about this. So Ben highlights future-based identity. You act today based on who you are becoming. And this is a powerful concept that I've personally been talking about for many years. I very first learned of the concept probably 20 years, maybe longer ago, when Jack Canfield wrote, it's a book that had a ton of, I can't remember the name of it, it just left me. But one of the concepts he talked about is acting as if you were already the person that you want to be. Okay, so this you're basically becoming you just become the person that is your future self. Okay, so here's how I related this to joy. So joy scales when you stop optimizing for momentary pleasure. So think about that and start compounding aliveness over time. Okay, this is really cool. So here's some things that you can do to compound joy and aliveness. Here's some practices. Long-term relationships over short-term dopamine hits. Nurture those relationships that mean something to you. Okay? Craft and mastery over quick wins. Something that takes time and skill, and that is part of the aliveness and the joy, right? So things that you can actually have mastery over, and over things that are just a quick win. Okay. Seasonal living instead of constant output. Okay. That I love, because if you think about, we have access to, foods that we should only have access to seasonally anytime we want them. Now, are they usually as good as plucking something off of a vine or off of a tree, or, picking something out of your garden? No, never. I mean, we are supposed to live seasonally. Okay. So seasonal living instead of constant output. All right. And then anticipation and memory as joy multipliers. So think about when we set up a vacation to someplace really warm and sunny or beautiful that we've always wanted to be, someplace exotic. and we start planning. That's anticipation. We have planned for this trip. This is part of where the joy sits, is in the anticipation. I mean, we're so used to getting everything as fast as when we want it. Think about, I remember when I saved up for my first car to be able to afford a down payment on a first car. There was the anticipation. And there's not just that, there's the memory that's built in to all of these things. And this is so important. These are joy multipliers. Okay. So joy compounds when you design your life like a long arc, like a big long arc, instead of just a feed, like a social media feed. That's not joy. It might be a quick dopamine hit of joy, but that is not true joy. And that is not how you really scale joy. So here's some questions about this time horizon concept that Ben talks about. What kind of life am I quietly building through my daily rhythms? Important question. Which joys deepen with time rather than disappear after consumption? So good. And how does my future self feel about how I am spending today? That's a great question. How does your future self feel about how you are living in this moment? Because that's all we really have right now, is this moment. And then in the future, we're living in that moment. That's the moment we have then. So how would your future self feel about how you're spending your time now? That is such a great question. Okay, now the next chapter, it talks about decision filters. Okay, so this is really, really good. And I love the way Ben's brain thinks. So here's what he said. This is almost like the subtraction principle a little bit. So scaled companies say no more often than they say yes. And what I've discovered is that a joyful life will do the same. Okay, so what you want to do is introduce a joy filter. So Ben introduces a decision filter in his book. So let's introduce a joy filter. Okay, so here's a question to ask yourself. Does this expand or contract my sense of aliveness now or later? Okay, and then use this filter. What this filter does, it will clarify boundaries, it will simplify your choices, it'll reduce regret, and it will increase the trust you have in yourself. Okay, this is what this filter will do. So joy scales when it becomes a non-negotiable design principle. You have these things that are put into place and they are non-negotiable. When you have a decision filter based on the concept of joy, then you're filtering everything through this filter. Okay, so here's some questions. What am I saying yes to that subtly contracts my aliveness? So it's subtle. It's a very subtle contraction of your aliveness. And I'm sure you can feel that. If there's something you say yes to and it takes away from your joy, there you go. That's it. You don't even have to, that is now your filter. Use that as a filter. If joy were non-negotiable, what would I choose differently? Think about that. And then this question, where am I betraying my own inner truth for external approval? Extremely important question. We betray our own truth so many times. And it becomes easier and easier once you stop doing that. And this is where the joy filter comes in. Okay. So the next one is measurement. So this is where you get to measure. Okay. You track aliveness, not your mood. Okay. So this is how you would actually measure something when it comes to the concept of scaling, but scaling joy. Okay. So Ben emphasizes that measuring, what you want to measure are the things that matter. Okay. You don't want to spend your time measuring all these things that don't matter. This is why the joy filter or the decision filter is the chapter before that. Okay. So then you have measurement. Okay. Joy is not measured by smiles. It's measured by vitality. Okay. That's perfect, right? So here are some better metrics. Think about this. Energy after interactions. So if you have energy after you interact with someone, a situation, whatever it is, and it's mostly situations and relationships. Okay. So this is now a metric for measurement. What's your energy like after you have these interactions? Okay. And then presence during ordinary moments. That's a measurement. That's a metric. How can I measure my presence in just ordinary moments? Sitting and having dinner with your family. Does everyone is everyone on their devices? Do you have a moment of just quiet, ordinary appreciation for sitting with a cup of tea? Um, do you just have these ordinary moments? These are the measurements, okay? How and then this. How often does time disappear? I mean, think about when you're in a place of just joy, and it's intentional joy, not these moments of blissed out, not that kind of joy, the joy we've been talking about. Time just disappears because you're just in that state. How deeply do you feel connected? How deeply in certain situations do you feel that you are totally connected? And then how alive do you feel in your body? These are all metrics. These are all measurement points. So I'm going to say these again really quick. So these are metrics, measuring points. Energy after interactions, presence during ordinary moments, how often time disappears, how deeply you feel connected, and how alive you feel in your body. Okay, scaled joy feels like fullness. This is what I've discovered. When you take this and put it into joy, it feels like fullness. It doesn't feel like just positivity, because sometimes you just have to fake positivity. Joy just feels like fullness. I feel fully alive in this moment. Okay, so here's some questions to ask yourself when you're looking at this chapter about measurement. Okay, what you're doing is you're tracking aliveness, not your mood. You're tracking how alive you feel. Okay, so when do I feel most present in ordinary moments? Like, sit with that. When are the moments that I feel the most present? In the moments I would consider ordinary. After which interactions do I feel more like myself and not less? We could probably sit and write several pages of this, or at least one full page of the moments when we feel less like ourselves. And then to write the moments that you feel more like yourself. Keep a tally. If you find yourself in a situation where you just walk out of a party, or you walk out of you get off a phone call that just uplifted you, or whatever, and you just feel alive and you feel full, then that's a metric. That's something to measure. And then this one, how often does time soften or dissolve for me? Perfect, right? Okay, now the next chapter talks about expansion, which is really amazing. And what this, how that you can relate this to joy is this: joy becomes generative. It means it just self-generates. Joy just generates, okay? At scale, this is how I'd compare it. Companies stop chasing growth and they become platforms. Okay, that's based on Ben's work. So at scale, companies stop chasing growth. Think about the mind swap that you have to stop chasing growth, because that's every single company, every single entrepreneurial marketing mastermind or summit I've sat at and participated in. It's all about how fast can we grow? We need a double business. We need to do that. Okay, so we need to look at this from a completely different lens, right? So when you scale, you stop chasing growth and you become a platform. Okay, so here's what we mean by that. At scale, joy stops being personal and it becomes contagious. It just becomes contagious. Okay, so here's some signs, and Ben has this in his book, signs that you've been able to expand. So signs that joy has scaled. Okay, others feel safer around you. You invite play and truth. You create emotional space for others, and your presence reduces urgency. Just your very presence reduces the urgency for whatever. I mean, we live in these heightened states of stress and what we're trying to do and what we're trying to expand and all the stuff, chasing the joy, chasing the positivity. So you bring it back down to your presence reduces urgency. Okay, I love that. Okay, so scaled joy is not loud, it's grounding. And that, to me, like, this is one of my favorite, scaling a company and put it into joy. This is one of my favorite. Scaled joy is not loud, it's simply grounding. And as a grounded Taurus, I'm telling you, talking about something that actually helps you feel grounded um, is such a beautiful thing. Okay, so here's some questions about expansion, and this is great. How does my inner state affect the emotional safeties of others? The emotional safety of others. Okay, so you're asking yourself, your own inner state, how are you affecting the emotional safety of others? Because you bring that to yourself first. It's absolutely stunning the way that you can feel in that environment as well. Where am I being invited to bring presence rather than solutions? Sometimes you don't need to bring all the answers. You just need to bring yourself and bring your presence. You know, I had the best week journaling throughout this whole and rereading his book. In fact, I actually listened to it 3 times this week. Um, and I'm a person who listens to my ebooks on Audible at either 1.25 or 1.5 speed. That's just the way my brain works. And I know some people can't listen like that. And so I listened to his book and I stopped and I rewound and I made a ton of notes 3 times. It's such a beautiful week. And I actually felt uh, a lot closer to Ben, even though we are close and we've always been, you have people in your family that you feel a little more tightly connected to, and Ben is definitely one of those people for me. Um, and yeah, so to me, I love that. Okay. So where am I being invited to bring presence rather than solutions? And then this last one in expansion, in what ways does my joy give others permission to just be themselves? Pretty great, right? Okay, so here's a final reframe, and this was kind of from the final chapter. Um, so the core equation is this: joy equals identity times environment times subtraction times leverage times time. Okay, or to put it more simply, joy scales when who you are, where you live, internally and externally, and what you allow are aligned. That's when joy scales. Okay, so I'm going to read that again. Joy scales when who you are, where you live internally and externally, and what you allow are aligned. That's when joy scales. And if you think about things that happen exponentially, I believe that this type of framework to even open up that conversation and absorb some of this information can help us scale joy, right? So here's a final reframe. And this is from the final chapter. Okay, you don't scale joy by being happier. Okay, so let your head wrap around that. You scale joy by doing this: becoming someone who feels deeply, designing your life to support aliveness. That you design your life to support being alive. Okay, removing what numbs you. So take away what numbs you. Investing in experiences that expand your perception, and playing the long game of being a human, right? I think that's absolutely brilliant. So this is what I would say to kind of end this. Okay, and this is perfect. So as I thought about this all during the week, I realized that these past couple of years, as I've gone through some of the hardest experiences of my life, I have been able to uh, continue with personal growth, find extreme moments of joy. And a lot of this does come from being absolutely present. And to me, this is a really good place for me just to tuck this in here, because I know many of you have been actually really benefiting from the focused life force energy. And I know I bring this up every once in a while, but I believe that this has been a really, really important piece for me to be able to stay in a place of love, especially unconditional love. um, Helps calm my nervous system is I have this beautiful technology over my home and over my business. And I've had it now for about almost 2.5 years now, probably 2 years and 4 months, so maybe 5 months. But I'm going to put a link below this video where you can go get a free trial. And this is not me just giving you a pitch. This to me is something that I feel that the times that we're in, this beautiful technology, which is based on quantum entanglement, We are all energy, we're all frequency. This to me has been one of the most helpful tools that has provided the support that I feel like that has allowed me to navigate my way through not just the changes that are happening in humanity, but in my own life on a personal level, with my business, with a really crazy government investigation into my business a couple years ago that just wound up last month, and some really intense personal things that have been happening in my relationship, family, just relationship stuff. And I really believe that this is technology that we should really be paying attention to. So if you're not aboard, give it a free try. You get 15 days to try it out. For me, I felt it the first day, and this is something that I will take with me and carry on my properties until I'm no longer a living human. But I'd love to know what you think about this whole idea of scaling joy by doing these things, by identifying who you are, subtracting things from your life rather than, just trying to be this positive person and say yes to all the things you don't want to say yes to. Like there's so many layers to this, right? And what I'd like to do is if you are a couple things, if you're an entrepreneur who's maybe read Ben's new book, The Science of Scaling, let me know in the comments what you think. What do you think about me taking this framework and putting it into the idea of joy? And maybe if you are an entrepreneur, you would like to read his book. I know you can get it for free on Audible. You can get it for free. But I also have a few copies that I would actually love to gift to somebody, a hard copy. So maybe the first 10 people who comment, I'd love a free copy. We can connect and I'll get your address if you live in the US, and I will ship you a free copy of this book because it's a beautiful book to read. And especially if you're a person who has a company that you would like to scale, and you'd like to scale it consciously. Because to me, this is the time for companies to do that. So yeah, this was a really fun week for me to just get into my nephew's work and just bring this into a different idea of scaling something that feels so important for humanity. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in. I'd love to know what you think about this, but have a beautiful, brilliant week, and we will see you next time.